Good afternoon and welcome to our viewers around the world. I'm Barry Pavel. I'm a Senior Vice President at the Atlantic Council and Director of the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security there. We're really delighted to have all of you join us today for what should be a really interesting and cutting-edge event hosted by the Scowcroft Center's Foresight Strategy and Risks Initiative team. The Scowcroft Center was founded in 2012 after our namesake General Brent Scowcroft to develop sustainable nonpartisan strategies that address the most important security challenges facing the United States and US allies and partners. The challenge that we are highlighting today is a growing one that's slowly eating away at the international rules-based system, affecting our way of life, prosperity, and security. Today's event marks the launch of a groundbreaking Atlantic Council report entitled States on the Cusp: Finding Solutions to Illicit Trade's Corrosive Effects in Developing Economies. The report is the result of nearly 2 years' worth of research, including intensive fieldwork on illicit trade in Southern Africa and Central America, and is yet another example of the forward-looking work being produced in the Scowcroft Center's Foresight team. Although there is no one universally accepted definition, for this report, the term illicit trade generally refers to legal goods that are traded illegally. It refers to how everyday consumer goods like handbags, cigarettes, and pharmaceuticals often are part of a poorly understood underworld. Global illicit trade is an intricate transboundary issue. The stakeholders include governments and firms, organized crime groups, and consumers. The adverse effects of illicit trade impact the public, the economy, and government. For many states, particularly in the global south, this trade is especially destabilizing. These are the states on the cusp that we have framed in the report's title. And this trade continues to grow. Today, it's around 7% of all global trade, with further acceleration and growth likely. So what can be done? What role do public and private stakeholders play? How can technology be leveraged, including cutting-edge technology that we'll hear about today? And what impact will the current pandemic have? We're absolutely delighted to have with us a phenomenal panel of experts who will provide some answers to these really important questions. Thanks to you all for joining us today to lead our discussion on this important subject. To engage in the conversation, please send your questions over Zoom by using the Q&A function or on Twitter using the hashtag #StatesOnTheCusp. With that, I'll hand it over to the Deputy Director of the Foresight Strategy and Risks Initiative, Peter Engelke, who will be moderating this event. Take it away, Peter.
Thank you so much, Barry, and welcome to the audience, as Barry said, all over the world. This truly is a global report in terms of its findings, its research, its implications, and as such, we're delighted that we have a global audience with us today. It is my great honor to moderate a conversation amongst a handful of truly exceptional people that will be with us today, including two of the report's authors. The panel consists of 4 individuals that I'd like to introduce very quickly before we begin with the substantive conversation. The first panelist is Tuesday Raitano, who is the Deputy Director of the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. Tuesday has held a number of senior policy and advisory positions, including with the Institute for Security Studies in Pretoria, with the European Commission and its program on counterterrorism, and a series of appointments within the UN system, including within the UN Office on Drugs and Crime. She has focused much of her work on crisis and post-conflict states, developing programs at the nexus between security and development. And she has, in her position at the Global Initiative, she has authored numerous policy-oriented and academic publications and reports with leading global institutions, and she is one of the lead authors of this report alongside Mark Shaw, who could not be with us today. Simone Haysam is our second panelist. Simone is a senior analyst also with the Global Initiative, having expertise in corruption and organized crime, and over a decade of experience conducting qualitative fieldwork in challenging environments. It's actually quite remarkable the kinds of work that she has done around the world. For example, she's been involved closely with her organization's pioneering work on heroin markets in Southern and East Africa, and has led multi-country studies on the development of such markets around these regions. And she is a contributing author of this report, having authored a working paper also published by the Atlantic Council, titled "The Illicit Tobacco Trade in Zimbabwe and South Africa." Our third panelist is Frank Chartier-Dumas, who is the head of business development for pharmaceutical traceability systems at SICPA, which is a company located in Lausanne, headquartered in Lausanne, Switzerland. Frank has over 15 years of international experience in business finance, operational excellence, and data management in pharmaceuticals, in information technologies and IT systems, and in packaging industries. And finally, Franklin Benz is a pharmacist, having degrees in chemistry and with a specialization in pharmaceutical chemistry. He currently works on quality control of medicines in the Laboratory of Standards and Quality of Medicines in Costa Rica. And I would have used the Spanish name for this, but as I don't speak Spanish, I'm certain I would have butchered the pronunciation, so I apologize for that. And is a founding member of Pharmaceutical Microbiology, which is an organization that promotes the health safety of medicines in Latin America. So thank you and welcome to all of the panelists. And so with that introduction, I'd like to start the substantive conversation. And as Barry mentioned, during the conversation, please, for the audience, please submit your questions in the chat if you have them, and we will try to get to as many of those as we possibly can towards the end of the hour that we're going to spend together. So Tuesday, why don't we begin with you as the lead author. This is a rich and substantive document. I can't reinforce that enough for the audience. It's worth spending some quality time with this document, given how serious the research is. I'm curious if you might take the viewers through the report at a very high level. And a first basic question, and this is to reinforce something that Barry put into the conversation at the outset, was what do we mean by illicit trade in the context of this report? Is it the same thing, for example, as the trade in narcotics and other sort of banned substances, or is it something else we're talking about?
Thank you so much, Peter, for the introduction. Thanks to Barry also for the opening remarks and stealing some of my statistics. And overall, thank you to partners at the Atlantic Council for all of the very positive collaboration that we've had over the duration of pulling this project together. It's enormously great to be here this evening for us in Europe to present it and finally see it go out to the world. As indeed, Peter, you do say this is a substantive and in-depth report, by which you really mean long, and it covers a lot of territory. What we did in it was to try and pick out and understand, first of all, what does illicit trade mean? And there isn't a good answer to that. It isn't a term that has a standard definition. It's used in a multiple of different contexts in different ways, sometimes as synonymous with organized crime itself, where it includes narcotic drugs, human trafficking. Other times it focuses perhaps more on the market for normally legal goods, which it either began in their provenance as counterfeits or substandard, or moved through their supply chain or through to the vendor and market points and became illicit along the way. Either they were moved in an illegal way against national regulations, they failed to pay proper taxation rates, and so on and so forth. And that was what we focused on in this particular case. So we were looking at normally legal goods, either produced illicitly or moved illicitly. It comes in some ways, it's less sexy than narcotic drugs, human trafficking, and the real sort of organized crime that we would usually consider. But actually, it's a huge problem. Barry started off with the statistics range that is usually given, somewhere between 3 and 7% of global GDP is attributed to counterfeit goods. A report published just last year in 2019 suggested that the counterfeit trade was worth something in the region of $510 billion a year, which is enormous. And what we've really seen in charting the growth of illicit trade is actually it's a problem that's accelerating faster than the global economy. So the percentage of illicit trade as a volume of GDP is rising. There's a share, and it's rising faster than GDP itself. So I think it's definitely a hot button issue, and one that we should be watching and focusing on with a great deal more attention. But by no means is a financial consideration sufficient when you're talking on the subject of illicit trade. And I think one of the challenges that when this conversation, particularly using the term counterfeiting, comes up is you tend to think of iPhones, electronic goods, luxury goods. I wish I could hold up a luxury good to show you, but I'm not so much in the price bracket of Hermes and Louis Vuitton, which are two of the highest and most frequently counterfeited luxury goods, which are an enormous part of the market for sure. But we also include in the illicit trade discussion the falsification of food and agricultural commodities, medical equipment, fake meds is a big issue, which my colleagues on the panel will bring up later, consumer goods, industrial goods, mechanical goods for the production of various things. And all of these, perhaps less sexy, but certainly very serious in terms of their public health and safety consequences. If you hone in just on the issue of counterfeit medicines, for example, the WHO estimates that counterfeit meds may be attributed to as much as 1 million deaths a year, and that 1 in 10 of all medical products used in low and middle income countries could be fake, substandard, or fraudulent. And I think in the context of the sort of headline issue that we all have today, which is COVID-19, you really begin to realize how much this matters. You know, in a global pandemic, what was the first thing that happened? You saw the rise of fake PPE, fake medicines, fake cures, faking test kits all over the internet. So, you know, this is a problem that's current, it's real, and it's costing lives. And I think that's why we think about it. And my golden retriever is even excited by that down beside me, so I apologize for that. Another side product of COVID. The other question you asked me, Peter, is like, why do we focus on the developing South? And I think that, and the report is called States on the Cusp. And I think one of the very illustrative issues of the title is that they're partially sitting on this cusp and balancing on the cusp because issues like illicit trade keep them there. So what we saw in the research that we did is that all of the challenges of illicit trade are more acute in the developing South, where weak institutions, low levels of capacity, corruption, insecurity, violence, a general societal lack of trust in the institutions of the state and the rule of law make it harder to respond to illicit trade. And similarly, these are one of the consequences, which is an enormous loss in tax revenue typically to the governments, is that then the lack of capacity of government to invest in development, to invest in promoting better regulation of key sectors, to address the insecurities, that, well, these are compromised because the tax revenue isn't there, the tax base isn't there. So there is a genuine, real and material damage in these countries to development in the rule of law. Notwithstanding, as is true across all illicit economies, including illicit trade, they are facilitated fundamentally by a wealth of corruption. And illicit trade is facilitating levels of corruption and feeding into an environment in which illicit trade is engendered at all levels of the government, from transactionally at customs and border posts through to the people who should be regulating, the sectors that should be controlling, and sometimes to the highest levels of the state. And the presentation from my colleague Simone, I'm sure will emphasize that point. And what final, before I sort of stop an opening remark, I think there's a real reason to talk about this issue now, because what we identified in the course of the research was a number of really concerning trends, and some of which, frankly, have been very much thrown into greater relief during the pandemic. Firstly is the privatization of infrastructure, such as ports, the proliferation of things like free trade zones, which have created a blind spot for governments, law enforcement, and regulators seeking to really understand what's happening in commodity supply chains. There are now thousands of free trade zones, and they're spread across 135 countries in the world. And what you have to understand about free trade zones is that they're in an area where there's less tariffs, there's less transparency, there are questions around ownership, there are questions around regulation. Some of the free trade zones also include manufacturing zones, where millions of workers are producing goods which then go out into global markets in essentially what's a little black box. So what we've created across the world, 135 countries, are these black spots, blind spots of global commodity flows. And into that environment, we can't see or understand what's coming. Quite an old study now, but a good one from the OECD and the EU Intellectual Property Office found that with every free trade zone came in a 6% increase in the rise of concerning imports and exports. So those which may be suspect, which either because they are not meeting regulatory standards or they're not meeting taxation standards, so they are falling in our category of illicit trade. The second concerning trend, again, thrown very much into relief by the pandemic, is the rise of internet marketplaces, e-commerce, and along with that, small package shipping. So these are also creating a blind spot in the global economy. Right now, before the pandemic, we had around $4 billion being transacted through e-commerce sites. In May 2020, the height of our pandemic lockdowns, that number actually doubled. So we saw double the amount of e-commerce transactions in a single month due to the pandemic. So e-commerce is definitely a trend that's on the rise at the moment. And the consequences then of these packages being sent out via small package shipment is that they're far harder for the standard regulatory control frameworks through ports and airports to be able to understand what's going through them. So our level of surveillance, which frankly is already very low on global commodity and trade flows, is even lower when those break up into small package flows. We also have, of course, online, the rise of the dark web and a greater knowledge and access for a larger number of people. But it's actually not a dark web issue. So much of what is being consumed that it falls within the illicit trade category is happening on the surface web, and is happening actually with a degree of legitimacy on very common e-commerce marketplaces or dedicated websites through peer-to-peer chat groups and social networks. If you go through Instagram, the number of looking for products like the luxury goods that I mentioned earlier, you'll find them for sale. And so part of this is really a question around consumer awareness. So the really concerning trend that we found overall is that you're seeing the scope for illegality, the scope for illicit trade growing, very much as the capacity for states to respond, to regulate, and to have oversight is weakening and declining. I think also finally, what's quite important to understand here is that not only is this a technical problem, but it's one of political will. And I feel like in the current environment, and the research showed us, that the political will to respond to the problem of illicit trade is also weakening. Not frankly that it was ever particularly high in the first place. There's a real zeitgeist to this conversation, which comes within the conversations around global inequality, that some people are saying, well, you know, what's so bad about this? Isn't this a victimless crime? Firstly, between the northern and southern hemispheres, the southern hemisphere dynamic is, well, you know, why shouldn't we be able to get an iPhone? Why shouldn't we be able to get a luxury handbag? Why shouldn't we be able to access life-saving medicines at a price that's reasonable to us? So if these sites and these networks will deliver them to us, we don't see any problem with that. We don't perceive this as a criminal problem. And that same kind of argument and rationale plays out just between rich and poor. And the global rate of inequality is at its most acute right now than it ever has been in the past. So I think, you know, here we have to answer to a conversation that is bigger than just the problem of illicit trade, but certainly compromises our ability to respond to it. What we've also seen as a challenge is that the balance of foreign investments, the balance of the global development conversation is also changing. So if you look at the patterns of how development aid to countries in the developing South is changing, it's now very much a South-centric conversation. By far and away, China is the biggest development donor to the developing South, either directly through bilateral or parastatal investment, but also through the new aid mechanisms that have been set up, like the South-South Development Bank or the Asia Development Bank, which are all Chinese underwritten. And the scale of those investments outweigh the standard Brookings institutions that we're used to, the IMF and the World Bank. So essentially the debate around what is considered just, good, right, and development itself in these states on the cusp is being led by a different set of actors. And these are ones who are questioning things like the validity of the intellectual property framework as it sits now. So I think we have to be aware that in some ways the influence of on governance and transparency has changed its timbre in the current environment. And finally, there's a far greater emphasis on private sector innovation and financing, both to support the growth of illicit, but legitimate markets, but also to respond to illicit markets. So a lot of our conversation as we go into this panel will be looking at the role of private sector innovation, private sector financing, and technology, and how it can help to respond. And this discussion around illicit trade is increasingly one now that is a private sector-led conversation. But the nature fundamentally of the international financial system makes this a hard one to have. Governments are, again, stepping back from some of their regulatory capacities or struggling to be effective in their regulatory roles. The FinCEN leaks of September this year certainly highlighted that, where we saw the challenge of the regulators and the banks to respond to the number of suspicious transaction reports that were being generated. And tax havens, secrecy jurisdictions also create a veil over the financial system that mirrors the veil that free trade zones are placing over the physical movement of commodities. So we're not always sure of the provenance of an ownership of funds when we talk about a public-private partnership or a private sector-led investment. So I think, and this has created, in some ways, a suspicion, which doesn't beget a sort of a positive and unidirectional multi-sectoral cooperation. So as we want to move forward, and we've said it very much, the political economy around illicit trade is very different. The roles that corporations want to play, the roles that government want to see, the role of stakeholders and consumers are all very different. And we explore some of those conversations in the report.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Tuesday, for summarizing the major findings and also framing the problem for us and giving us a sense of the scale of its scale as well. And with that, I'd like to turn perhaps to Simone. Simone is a contributing author of the report, and she was engaged in field research, conducting her work in Southern Africa, specifically in South Africa and in Zimbabwe, focusing on one type of commodity, tobacco products. And if for those of you who are interested, although the findings are summarized in this particular report, the States on the Cusp report, the Atlantic Council, under Simone's name, also published a document going into greater detail about those findings. And that document is titled The Illicit Tobacco Trade in Zimbabwe and South Africa. And it is available, of course, online at the Atlantic Council, and I believe also at GI's website as well. Simone, so very quickly, I was wondering if you might summarize, do a couple things for the audience. Summarize your research findings when you went on when you conducted your field research and your desk research on this nexus of issues surrounding the illicit tobacco trade in Southern Africa. And secondly, if you might also then give us a sense of the implications of those findings for the larger conversation we're having today.
Sure. Thanks very much, Peter, and thank you very much to the Atlantic Council for this entire project, which for me allowed me to explore really one of the key illicit economy and corruption issues affecting Southern Africa and South Africa, which is one of the regions which I work most closely. In sub-Saharan Africa, the locus of the illegal cigarette trade is really in Southern Africa, particularly in South Africa, which presents the largest consumer market for cigarettes and tobacco products, but also pulls in a range of neighboring states where factories are often located, production happens, and from which cross-border smuggling often originates. The South African market, it's quite hard to get sort of very recent figures, but there are perhaps around 7 million smokers and about 7 billion cigarettes being consumed, with a smoking rate of around 20% of the population. So there is quite a lot of money to be made servicing that market. And I think if you were to ask an ordinary South African what the biggest, most lucrative, most corrupting illegal market in the country is after drugs, they would say cigarettes. You really can't write a history of either the illicit economy or of grand corruption in South Africa without talking about what happened in the illicit tobacco economy between around 2012 and 2017. With possibly, unfortunately, another recent turning point in 2020. I'll try to give a sort of picture of what that sort of illicit economy looks like, a little bit of sense of the scale of it. And then I will talk about corruption, which I think is really the issue which is at the heart of what's important about illicit cigarettes in the sub-Saharan, the Southern African region. So unlike in, I think, a lot of places, for example, in Europe, where illicit cigarettes, illicit tobacco is very much understood as a cross-border smuggling issue. In South Africa, at its peak, illicit cigarettes were really about primarily about under-declaration in factories that were located inside the country. There was a large amount of undeclared production. There was stock that was lost in transit. There was a large amount of ghost exports. The most recent figure in 2020, 66% of all cigarettes marked for export from South Africa didn't reach their final destinations. So that was a very popular technique. And then there was also a degree of cross-border smuggling. The report focuses on South Africa and Zimbabwe because the histories sort of the cigarette industry between these two countries are very intertwined. You have a lot of figures who have dual nationality and who move between the two countries. And in the 2010s, cross-border smuggling was more prevalent, and a lot of that came over Zimbabwean borders from production facilities that were located there. From around 2012, that started to shift, and more factories were located within South Africa and under declaring. The products that they declared were often just new brands that people hadn't heard of, but they were significantly cheaper than cigarettes that had sort of were for sale and had tax paid on them. And they were laundered into very informal trading networks, often through what we call cash and carry shops, often retailed at spaza shops, sort of informal general dealer stores in very low income suburbs, to a market where people were often buying single cigarettes. And where there sort of was very low brand loyalty, prices a much bigger motivation on what cigarettes people would smoke. And the sort of estimates that have been done by the University of Cape Town, which hosts a unit which is one of the major sources for independent information about the illicit economy. One of the features of the illicit economy, I would say, is an extremely sort of polarized information space within the country, with a lot of partisan research bodies producing research, which is often suspect. But they estimate that illicit trade probably made up about 26% of the market before 2010. Thereafter, it actually declined as a result of state intervention and some quite smart enforcement techniques to around 17%. And from 2012, when the state itself and those law enforcement bodies sort of came under pressure and started to be degraded through processes of corruption, the illicit market exploded and probably reached about 35% of the total market. There were indications that it was declining again after 2018, when state capacity was again rising. But during the COVID response, cigarettes were banned. The sale of cigarettes was banned completely on the pretext of health reasons. And that obviously made the entire market illicit, which we believe has had sort of quite bad and probably longer lasting effects on the scale of the illicit market in South Africa. Why does it matter? Sorry, Peter?
Yes, exactly. That's the question I was going to follow with was why does this matter, and what are the implications for the beyond this region?
Sure. So I mean, generally with illicit cigarettes, the two primary impacts that people would mention first are around sort of health, and secondly around loss to the fiscus. The price of cigarettes in South Africa, as in many parts of the world, has risen sort of quite significantly as the country has moved to put in place WHO recommendations around measures to reduce the amount of the population that smokes, which include rising excise taxes. The availability of much cheaper illegal cigarettes obviously undermines the intended effect of what often get called sin taxes. Cheap smokes keep people smoking and may mean that new smokers get drawn into the fold. On the fiscal aspects, British American Tobacco, which is one of the largest multinational companies that operates in Southern Africa and Zimbabwe, is also one of the biggest contributors, single contributors to the government purse. There are a lot of estimates of what the fiscus loss is. As I've said, they often come from sources which are considered to be partial. But they always run into multiple billions of rands, with they're about 16 South African rands to $1 US. And in March of this year, the Commissioner of the Revenue Service said that as the result of enforcement action in just 1 year, they'd been able to recover 2.6 billion rand in sort of what would have been lost revenue. So it's a punch in the gut for state resources is how it's often presented.
So the public health and the fiscal consequences of this particular nexus of challenges surrounding the tobacco problem is also one that surrounds many of the kinds of commodities that are traded in this larger global picture. And so on that front, this report, States on the Cusp, also included a paper on the illicit pharmaceutical trade in Central America. And again, just to repeat, for those of you who are interested, there's a link to the report and the two working papers in the chat. But the title of that report is Dark Pharma, Counterfeit and Contraband Pharmaceuticals in Central America, and by Peter Tinti, who is a colleague of Simone's. And so that, without going into too much detail, that paper, as summarized in the States on the Cusp report, also lays out a series of analogous challenges in the pharmaceutical space, wherein within the Central America region, high poverty levels, lack of adequate healthcare and regulation, a rapidly growing internet trade in medicines, and high drug prices together create a thriving black and gray market in pharmaceuticals, and therefore very significant effects similar to what Simone has been talking about in terms of the quality of the products that are available, in this case medicines, which obviously have very direct public health impacts, and in particular on poorer people who are often forced for price reasons to go in search of pharmaceuticals that are traded illegally in a black or a gray market. And therefore there are a series of knock-on consequences: erosion in public confidence in the pharmaceutical market, an erosion of public confidence in the health sector, and ultimately, as Tuesday outlined at the beginning of the conversation, and outlined in confidence in the government. And so here I'd like to maybe turn to Franklin, to very quickly, Franklin, if you don't mind, giving us your thoughts on what the illegal pharmaceuticals trade looks like in Costa Rica, sorry, not just Costa Rica, but in Central America in general. In other words, in your estimation, what are the core challenges and what are the impacts of this trade in general?
Thank you very much for your time. Thank you also to Atlantic Hosting for this invitation. Well, what I have to say, maybe if I just have 1 minute to share with you, is I want to leave this message. In Central America, the illicit trade of medication is still needing even more discussion and technical action. And of course, this report that we're talking about was enriched by government officials, law enforcement representatives, healthcare providers, and even people who is selling that illicit medications in the streets. Okay, so that's why very important, and it brings me the idea of asking, maybe to share with you also what has further empowered consumers and vendors in illicit trade of medicines. So those factors could be brief as the global internet penetration, the proliferation of foreign social media messaging apps, combined with the emergence in mainstreaming of the dark web and cryptocurrencies. But let's just focus in Costa Rica. Just in 2014, the problem of contraband, including non-pharmaceutical goods, was bigger than the problem of drug trafficking, costing the country up to 100 million every year in those taxes. Nevertheless, counterfeit medicines continues, and the report has included this information, continues to be viewed by national authorities as minor problem. And what they argue is that the market for pharmaceuticals in Costa Rica is highly regulated. And what I have to say about that is that it is true in the sense that Costa Rica is covered, the whole people from Costa Rica is covered by the Social Security. Approximately 40% of medicine in Costa Rica are supplied through the institution that I work for, that is Caja Costarricense del Seguro Social, the one I will just call Caja, of course, because the name is very long. So this organization covers the 100% of the people of the country by these social security systems and is the biggest buyer of medications. So just to keep in mind, Guatemala, which is also in Central America, and Costa Rica are the biggest buyers of medications in Central America. Of course, Salvador, Nicaragua, Panama are also important in this equation, but Guatemala and Costa Rica are the biggest buyers. One thing in positive that I have to say for the Social Security is that the place where I work for, this laboratory, the one we call Laboratorio de Normas y Calidad de Medicamentos, has been focused for almost 45 years in the evaluation of medications, those medications that Caja Costarricense del Seguro Social buys for the people. But of course, the evaluation of these medications that we are doing is for medicine that are being bought by the institution, not for counterfeit or fake drugs, okay? So if I could have, I will be very fast in this part, but if I could be focusing 4 important topics in Costa Rica, and all of them are included in the report too, are these 4. The brand falsifications. This brand falsification is driven by the fact that generic drugs from India and China, and believe me, I see every day those medications coming from those parts of the world, these generic drugs are becoming more prevalent. And as a result, counterfeiters may seek to repackage generics in order to sell them on black market under the brand name equivalent. The second topic will be the smuggling, because our porous borders, not only Costa Rica, but also Guatemala and Nicaragua, and the limited number of official border crossing also provide an opportunity for criminal networks may seek to profit in several ways. For example, a very large counterfeit case in 2015 in which law enforcement authorities broke up a family ring that was selling a very popular ointment in Costa Rica. This ointment was Cofal. Everybody knows this ointment because everybody has used it since we were child. But also one more another example that I would like to share with you is one that is already introduced in a report titled Trade in Counterfeit Pharmaceutical Products by OECD. And what they have placed there is that in 2017, US federal laws enforcement shares 18 members of AFPower organization. This of AFPower's organization, its administrative headquarters and customer service department was located in Costa Rica, while their servers were hosted in American websites in Cyprus. So what does it mean in money, in dollars? Well, the global operation generated by these AFPA organizations was over 1 million prescription orders in 2 years, generating more than 125 million of dollars. So it means that Costa Rica in 2007 was seen like a technological hub to administrate this illicit market. The third and the fourth topic that I would like to finally share with you is, of course, the internet. People using internet are turning to numerous professional-looking websites. Social media is increasingly used to advertise contraband pharmaceutical at rates cheaper than available through formal hospital and pharmacies. And yesterday, when I was just taking a look around the social media, and I typed some words like misoprostol or acetaminophen, some medications that you can find here, there are people that can sell them to you by Facebook, by mercadolibre.com, and they come to your house and they leave you the medication in your house. And then the fourth topic is that these medications are sold in public places. In Costa Rica, there's a very popular park. The name is Parque La Merced, where people from all over the world can be found there. People from Nicaragua, Guatemala, Salvador, even from Cameroon and countries from Africa, they are there, and they are there to sell fake medications to the people. Believe me, I did a job when I was at the degree of pharmacy in Costa Rica, and we went there to try to see what was happening there, only just to take a look. And it's really true. You can go there and find analgesic, antibiotics, even injections, and even medical devices. It also helped me to remember that when I was a student, I did my social work on the southern border of Costa Rica. And my job was to identify the social security pharmacy was giving patients extra drugs. That was a problem that was happening there in the hospital. So I found a person who was blind, who was also deaf, and who had the daily routine of going through 3 social security pharmacies, picking up medication, and nobody said no to him because he had those disabilities. So I followed him for the whole day, and at the end of the afternoon, we arrived to his house, and his mother told me that he took those medications to put them under his bed and to give them to the poor people. Of course, behind this could be the black market of people who is selling medication from Caja Costarricense de Seguro Social to the black market in Costa Rica and to the black market in Central America. And more recently, in my laboratory, Laboratorio de Normas, we received almost 30 different samples of medications that the police in San Jose, Costa Rica, found on the street. Someone was selling them, and so the police went there and they took those samples and they sent us those samples to us. Finally, and of course, giving answer to your questions, Peter, I will say that Costa Rica has taken part of Operation Pangea with the CONAPIF, which is a group, a multifactorial group working on this. But what I have to say, please let me tell you that's my opinion on this, is that Operation Pangea is a reaction solution. We should be more focused in learning what is happening behind the counterfeit drugs, behind the illicit trade of medication in Central America. We are in the center of America. We are a very tiny country where you can cross from the south to the Pacific, from the north to the south just in hours, and with any kind of control. And of course, and that's what the results of Pangea operation has shown, even on newspaper, the big amount and the billion of dollars that it means to the populations. People taking illicit drugs can be in risk, of course, because those drugs contain different quantity of the original active ingredient. It may be different active ingredients. Also, it could contain toxic ingredients, as happened in Panama some years ago with the contamination of a toothpaste. And then also they are not under good conditions of storage, and also they are not in conditions of good manufacturing practices. So that's the big idea, the big image of how is it going in Central America.
Franklin, thank you so much for that summary. Much appreciated. I think it's at the point now where we need to turn to solutions. What can we do given the scale of this problem, given the different regions of the world that it impacts, it essentially impacts everyone, given the huge number of commodities affected here, and then given the effects on society, economy, and politics, governance. what can we do? The report goes at length into this question. And to help us with that, at least through one very important dimension of that is our last panelist, Frank. Frank, I'd like to ask you, to give us your sense in the pharmaceutical space, given Franklin's comments that we just heard, but also more generally, how do you look at the solution space for dealing with this problem?
Thank you, Peter, and thank you to the Atlantic Council to inviting me to this panel. First, I want to congratulate the team for the very inspiring report and the precise description of real situations in the field that has been made. Your research in Costa Rica and in Guatemala clearly shows the complexity of tackling these multifactorial, multi-component problems, and the importance also to understand the country's specificities, especially in terms of healthcare structures. The positive news is that indeed there is a large range of efficient technologies to help tackle illicit trade of pharmaceuticals. I will just share with you a slide to make the overview slightly more visual. So the main focus of these solutions are essentially the product integrity and the supply chain integrity. Securing the product is about the integrity of the pack itself and also its content. So the first features that you can have are unprecedented solutions like adhesive seals with security die-cuts to prevent from accessing the content of a pack without altering the secondary packaging. To allow the authentication of a pack, we recommend the use of secure labels embedding security inks, which will guarantee that the pack is genuine. A patient can easily identify the original product thanks to this unforgeable label, for example, with color shift or logo shift just when tilting the pack. So this solution is increasingly adopted by pharma manufacturers worldwide. Then controls can also be made through a web app or a mobile app, which will provide additional information to the consumer, for example, in case of a recall. And we also see that blockchain certificates are another possibility to secure the authenticity of a product. For example, we use this type of solution for COVID-19 test kits, where you have to also secure the content of a pack with multi-kits. Another option is the Rfid Tracking. The issue is that it's usually very expensive and operationally complex to implement. As you mentioned it in your report, unit dose marking is technically feasible today, but also not easy to apply, as it should not impact the production process, and also as it should respect strict market authorization rules to guarantee the product safety. Another major action, technology that is used on the packs themselves is the product serialization, which means to attribute a unique ID with a serial number to each pack of medicine, usually through direct marking on the secondary packaging with what we call a serialization station, which is directly implemented on the production line of a manufacturer in its facilities. We also use aggregation stations to link digitally the packs to bigger cases or pallets, and so to have the full traceability. So this unique ID will be the basis for the other part of solutions regarding the supply chain integrity. It will be the basis for digital monitoring, and so to implement track and trace systems to control and secure the supply chain. Each event, which means each movement of the product along the supply chain, will be reported to either a central database or shared within the stakeholders of the supply chain. In theory, the control is made when scanning the pack at point of dispense, which confirms immediately to the patient if the product is valid. A new technology that you mentioned in your report as well is blockchain. Here as well, thanks to blockchain, we can make this audit trail immutable and become indisputable, but also guarantee the integrity of processes of data exchange and access to data. And the important thing is that generating trustable data is a prerequisite for further interpretation and to make impacting to make impacting decision. Here there is an emergence of big data platforms with real-time analytics embedding artificial intelligence, and which can accelerate the detection of abnormal flows of products like cross-border diversion, which is very usual in pharma, or unusual levels of consumptions of specific drugs. So they are a great monitoring tool for tracking the weak parts of the distribution network, and also in the meantime for improving public health systems, which you describe in the report as being a key reason for intrusion of traffickers. So based on all these options on our experience in the field over the last years, our recommendation to tackle the illicit trade of pharmaceutical is, from a technological perspective, to combine as much as possible material security with digital monitoring. From a geographical perspective, it's to combine local tracking solutions with wider regional surveillance systems. This requires the coordination of countries, trust in data exchange, to make sure we acquire the visibility across borders. It also necessitates the adoption of common criminal laws and enforcement procedures to make sure that traffickers can be sued in any country. The issue is often that some traffickers are producing the medicine in Asia, making them transit through the Gulf and selling them, for example, in Africa and in Latin America. So it's very hard if there is not an harmonization of the criminal laws and enforcement to go back to the full chain of traffickers. And our last recommendation is to keep in mind that it's very important to educate populations and make citizens aware, first, of the risk of consuming product without knowing its provenance, its conservation conditions like cold chain, and also to make them aware that there are tools available today to control that products are genuine, and also to trust that the official point of dispense will deliver them true and genuine products.
All right, thank you so much, Frank, for that intervention. I'm looking at the clock, and we've got looks like 6 minutes left, and I'd like to do a couple of things. One would be to return to Tuesday, who is the lead author of the report, or one of the lead authors of the report, and to get her thoughts on the question involving solutions. And at the same time, maybe take a question from the audience. One question in particular that caught my eye was the question of, given this enormous problem that all of us have been talking about in one way or another, how do we attack the problem of government corruption? So in other words, what is the nexus between this set of issues we're talking about and the officialdom and its ability to withstand, fight against, counter the corrosive influence of the trade on governance? So Tuesday, maybe a couple thoughts. One is, what are your general thoughts on solutions specifically, general thoughts on solutions, and then specifically your thoughts on countering corruption?
Thank you so much, Peter. And thank you to, I think it was Robert, for the excellent question. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, there's basically sort of in a Venn diagram of answering the problem of illicit trade and answering the problem of corruption, there's like a 100% overlap. You heard a lot from Frank in this discussion around the potential for technology, the potential to create a better oversight of the space, and even on technologies like blockchain, to provide a end-to-end tracking system for commodities. But fundamentally, I think, to use the old trope, some of these are very much undermined by a garbage in, garbage out dynamic, which means that if you can't control and regulate what goes into the systems of monitoring, that means, if they are at the site of natural resource extraction, as an example, or production, you don't have a sense of what's happening. The individual agents are potentially corrupt. There's an overall lax attitude towards their production. Then that information is fed throughout and along the system. And so for us, technology has extraordinary potential and has shown really impressive results, but it has to be within an understanding of the broader political economy. And so then what to do? I mean, our report all the way through said, this is a holistic problem. This is something where you need to understand the different dynamics and you need to address all of them. So one of our key recommendations was definitely you have to address them in a place where the political will, the political integrity, the societal integrity, and actually the physical integrity of the source and transit are sufficient to be able to give you oversight. And if you don't have that, I mean, it's tempting to say, well, throw the debate away, but that feels wrong. So what we really looked at is to say, be nuanced, take the opportunities where they provide themselves. Certain commodities have a greater kind of impetus and collateral than others. If there is a direct life-saving link that can be drawn, as in Franklin's example on counterfeit medicines, if there are certain times, and I would say we're in one now, essentially, a potential strategic inflection point where a whole debate can be changed by a catalytic event like COVID, there is an opportunity to act. So what we are recommending, I think, is, first of all, we need better information on illicit trade. We need to keep the scale, the scope, and the importance high up on the political agenda. I mean, as an example, annually, it's estimated that around $100 billion is spent on the war on drugs, but there is absolutely no equivalent on the war on intellectual property or trade integrity. And very sadly, the World Trade Organization set up a trade facilitation alliance, which was meant to be a multilateral effort to try and strengthen the integrity of trade channels. And that's received less than $15 million since it was launched in 2018. So from 100 billion to fighting narcotics to 15 million in fighting illicit trade, which, as you'll recall from my opening, was a $500 billion trade a year. So I think in part it's a question of saying, this isn't just about fake goods. This isn't just about, my desire to have a Hermès scarf. It's actually about very real problems and to make those clear. And that works at the international level, it works at the regional level, and it works at the national level and individual agendas. So partly, I think, particularly in corrupt environments, this is a bottom-up question. So how do you make consumers aware? And Franklin spoke on some of these, and so did Frank. How do you build a consumer awareness of costs and risks? How do you get them to put a pressure on their elected officials and state institutions? And this, again, is where there's that strong intersection. So, we are very proud as a civil society organization at the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, and in partnership with the Atlantic Council, or also a civil society organization, to be raising these issues on the agenda, because I think that's part of the role of civil society, to create an open dialogue. So where better to end then, I think, at this panel than to say, we have to open a dialogue, we have to build awareness, we have to share the message, and we need combined synergistic approaches like we've achieved on our panel today.
Well, Tuesday, I literally could not have said what you just said any better than you have just said it. As a closing remark, having said that, I am now in the position where I will be closing the event. You are absolutely correct, Tuesday, in that the point of this effort was to do exactly what you just described, which was to facilitate a conversation around this enormous problem, which is generally underappreciated, yet which reaches into state, society, and economy in countless ways, and is enormously corrosive to those states particularly in the global South, but also frankly in the global North as well, and has all these impacts that we've been talking about throughout the course of the afternoon. So we anticipate that this will be just the first among several dialogues that the Atlantic Council, in cooperation with our partners, will be having in and around this space. To our panelists, Frank, Simone, Franklin, and of course Tuesday, thank you all again so much for your participation. It was delightful to have all of you here. And to our audience, thank you all for joining us. And with that, good afternoon, good evening, or good morning, wherever you are in the world. And we will see you next time. Thank you very much.